Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, all back on mute if you wouldn't mind for the time being. So to remind you, the President series of events are intended to act as conversations between members of this learned society and sometimes non-members of the learned society about the nature and scope of this thing that we call cybernetics. Interpretations, as I keep discovering, vary widely, which is good and entertaining and amusing and gives people like me plenty to argue about, which always makes me joyful. This is the fifth in a series, and the first thing I'm going to tell you tonight, and I will put it in the chat in a short while, is that the recordings of the previous four are now all available on YouTube. So if you've missed anything, you can now go back and have a good listen to the erudite previous speakers. At least I think they were erudite, certainly, and learned. The process for the evening is that we have two speakers, Patrick Hoverstadt and David Dewhurst. Patrick is going to speak first. We'll listen politely for half an hour, write down deep and searching questions, and then ask one or two of them at the end. For a couple of minutes, then rapidly moving on to David, and we'll again listen learnedly and write down difficult questions, and again have 5 minutes of a bit of Q&A at the end of David. Then we will try and synthesize some learning from the whole. We will try and put together the ideas and say, oh, what did these things have in common, if anything, and what do they have that's different, and what can they learn from each other? And then when we get fed up and we've had enough and it's 5 to 7, we'll pack up and go home. If you want to park questions in the meanwhile, I'm sure you're all now happily Zoom familiar. There is a chat facility which pops up and you can put messages in it. Angus will look particularly for admin messages, help messages. I will look particularly for important questions that we can ask our two speakers. If that all makes sense to everybody, and I'm sure it does at this point, I will introduce Patrick Hoverstadt, our first speaker. Patrick and I probably first met 20-ish years ago, I think in Robin Asby's lounge in Todmorden of all strange
It was indeed.
Have occasionally exchanged insults, challenges, and whatever in between times. I've read his books. I'd like to think he's read mine, but you never know. We won't actually hold him to account for that this afternoon. Patrick is still chairman of SCIO, I think. Systems and Cybernetics and Organisation, SCIO, and is a practicing consultant using cybernetics ideas in his consulting practice with clients large and small, many and various. So, Patrick, if you want to say anything more about yourself, please do. Otherwise, it's 17:06, and I'll wave at you at about 17:36 and get you to stop. Okay?
Okay. Well, thanks for that, John. So if I can do the screen sharing thing, that'll be kind of splendid. Has that worked?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So had a bit of a conversation with John about what we're going to talk about tonight, and I could have done various topics. So obviously done a lot of work in the past around VSM, and so we could have talked about that or cybernetics more generally. But what I thought would be maybe, well, be interesting from my point of view. I don't know if it'd be interesting from your point of view, but hopefully, fingers crossed, is to talk about the experience of using this in not in anger, but in practice out there. So been doing this for kind of longer than care to remember. So just over 25 years of using this stuff practically with clients. I must confess, I've only been to one Cybernetics Society meeting. It was a long time ago. And I think John's description of a learned society was kind of apposite, as in it didn't actually seem to have much to do with, well, there wasn't much of the discussion that had much to do with actual practice. So I thought, I don't know how things have changed since then, but I thought actually touching on what this looks like from a practitioner point of view might be interesting to members. Maybe not. We shall see. So this is kind of looking at it from an inaction perspective, and I thought I probably ought to start with a with a systems-y kind of thing, and delighted to see we've got vanilla beer on the call. So, you know, looking at this VSM as a cybernetic model, and thinking about the cybernetics around this, obviously there is between the system and its environment, there is a perceptual loop, cybernetic loop. We build models of of reality, and we use those to interrogate reality. And there's the feedback loop that we use to perceive whether we are right or not. There's a feedback loop around decisioning and enacting. What is it we're actually going to do about that? And then a loop around the actual action that the system might undertake in its environment. And that's all very lovely, but all of that is kind of to some extent disconnected. And I'm minded of the Reg Revens quote: "There can be no learning without action, and no action without learning." And I think for a learned society, this has some quite serious implications. And of course, it changes the cybernetics of what we're looking at. So as soon as one of the things about the actual act of acting and the interaction between the system and its environment is it creates a new source of information. One of the interesting things I've found out about lots of mental illnesses actually is the dissociation of the perceptual loop and the model making that is intrinsic to that from reality. So lots of mental illnesses have as an element in them that dissociation between the reality and the perception of the reality. And for me, this is a critical issue in modeling. It's a critical issue for us as cyberneticians, and it does the closure of that. So from action, that changes the nature of the feedback into the decision making, into the perception, and back towards the action. And then that loop goes round the other way to change what decisions we take, and therefore what action we will take in the future. So there's a closure that happens within each loop, but the closure of the total system is only through action. Hence the Revens quote, really: "No learning without action, and no action without learning." And I think that's the doing this for real, doing it a lot, gives you a completely different insight on the theory to some extent. So what I thought I'd cover in this wee chat, really, and do feel free to break in at any point. So I'm not kind of precious about this, is a little bit on why I think systems and cybernetics, and apologies because I am kind of folding the two together and in a way that might seem a bit sloppy. Why systems and cybernetics, why it matters to me. What's changed over the 26 years I've been consulting with it. So what's changed out there in the market, from really this being perceived as something that existed in a ghetto, to relatively not mainstream, but getting towards mainstream. And in the way certainly I go about using it, from having it to do it as a kind of covert action, you know, you couldn't actually tell people what you were doing, to it being very overt and very explicit. And then going on to talk a little bit about getting the ideas used. So getting theory into practice, and what works and what doesn't, and why that might be. So that's what I'm planning to kind of go through. Sorry. So this is kind of us. We do basically 4 areas of stuff. So we do stuff around organization. We do diagnosis and development and design of organizations. And we do that principally built around Vanilla's dad's VSM. And I've been using that since the early 90s. and love it to bits. We do stuff around strategy. So we've developed an approach, what I think is the first systemic approach designed specifically to do business strategy, patterns of strategy. And it's really built around, or it's built on the back, in the sense of Maturana's model of structural coupling. So it's a model of how organizations are structurally coupled to other systems in their environment, and what that means, and the dynamics that engenders, and understanding that as the driver of emergent strategy. We do stuff around transformation with a model that we developed a long time ago, which is slightly derivative of VSM. So it's not VSM, but it's certainly informed by VSM. And we do ecosystem modeling. Increasingly, we do ecosystem modeling of business ecosystems. This is a big pharma one. Doing some work coming up with UKRI, so the umbrella body for research for the UK government, on mapping ecosystems. And increasingly getting asked to do work at sort of multi-organizational level that we would classify as ecosystem modeling. So those are the sort of areas in which we operate. We pretty much exclusively use systems and cybernetic approaches. And we do so basically because they work better than anything else. We done work for wide variety of clients in private sector, public sector, third sector. So this is stuff that goes quite a long way. This is not, it's not a niche thing really. And in terms of numbers, over 25 years of practice, over 2,500 systems projects, over 80 clients, 19 countries, all sizes, from micro businesses to multinationals to national level public sector stuff, and been involved in delivering systems courses at HE level to over 7,500 students. So there's a lot, there's a lot going on really. There's a lot to go at. This is not a sort of, practice in a corner kind of thing. Why for me is one of these things is that it always provides systems and cybernetics always provides an alternative approach to traditional approaches. So the vast majority of management, which is kind of where I play, management approaches are still linear, still reductionist, still flat. So bringing cybernetics and systemic models, multi-level models to that, it always gives you a different way of tackling intractable problems. So, I mean, I love it because I love it, but I mean, also from a practical point of view, it provides more answers than anything else I've come across. I mean, originally I got into VSM, not because I was enraptured with VSM, but because I was interested in organizations, and it just gave me more answers than anything else did. And I've kind of followed on from that really. When you look at management and organization, there's a kind of mass failure of traditional approaches that is often not talked about. Kind of everybody knows, but nobody talks about it. So if you look at the failure rate of strategy, the survey results vary from, the most optimistic I've seen is like something like a 70% failure rate. 90% failure rate comes from Kaplan and Norton, the balanced scorecard people who are kind of not wild-eyed, wild-haired nutters. They're sort of as mainstream as you could possibly hope for, really. Rusakov reported up to 98% failure rate. So something's going quite seriously wrong with that, and the bizarre thing I find is that people kind of know this, and nobody really bats an eyelid. I did a keynote at the Association for Strategic Planning conference, which is like the professional body for strategists in the US, a couple of years ago, and I stuck these figures up, and I kind of expected them to be chucking, if not rocks, at least rotten fruit at me for saying what you do doesn't work. But everybody kind of knew and just accepted it, that actually that is the failure rate. If you talk to change managers, they will readily say, oh yeah, we get a 70 to 80% failure rate. Same with big projects. And for some bizarre reason, nobody goes, oh, well, there must be something fundamentally wrong with the way we're approaching this. They seem to have this sort of fatalistic, oh, we'll just carry on doing what we're doing. And of course, from our point of view, you know, you look at these things from a systemic and particularly a cybernetic viewpoint, actually, and you go, well, it really isn't a surprise that strategy fails that often. From a systems and a cybernetic point of view, you would kind of expect it to fail as often as it does. It's not just, oh, people didn't try hard enough. You know, the fundamentals of the thinking are wrong in traditional models. OD that isn't about O. So, you know, there's a whole discipline around organization development that doesn't even look at organization. They, you know, kind of rather miss the point. So there's a hell of a lot to go at there. And one of the things I love about systems and cybernetic approaches, the rigor. They're sophisticated, they're flexible, and compared to anything else, they are actually really, really fast. So, you know, dramatically quick in some cases. And all of those are huge advantages for the practitioner, I would say. This is some survey results. So this is a CEO's view of what they're facing in terms of complexity. So if you think about systems and cybernetic approaches as being about dealing with uncertainty and complexity, 1,400 CEOs, 78% said reducing complexity is one of their priorities, and equivalent number engaged in 5 or more such programs. 91% think complexity demands special tools, but only 5% think they've got them. So there's a massive gap in what the world is kind of screaming for and what they have in the conventional toolkit. You know, this is a target-rich environment, really. And this, I think, is quite shocking, the corporate failure rate. So the S&P 500 is the 500 top companies in the US in terms of size. So the US is still the most successful, despite Donald Trump, is still the most successful economy in the world. And of the original S&P 500, 85% failed over a 40-year period. So this is actually 2006 figures. So this is before the last financial crisis. Of the top 1,000 companies in the world, half lost 20% of their value in a period of a month over a 10-year period. So that level of turbulence and that level of organizational failure is endemic. It's normal. 35% of fatal strategic risk to organizations came from a direction they didn't even think to look at. So we've got massive failure in strategy, massive failures in change, massive failure in the ability to execute projects. And it may or may not correlate with the fact that we've got massive rate of corporate failure and it's getting worse. Don't know if many of you know this, but a brilliant piece of research by a mate of mine in Switzerland. He looked at the relationship between how VSME organizations are and their ability to avoid or survive an existential crisis, and found a 71% correlation, which in the world of management stuff is absolutely epic. It is the best predictor of organizational survival by a long way. So I think we got some good kit there, really, and certainly a hell of a lot better than anything else that's floating around out there. I think, you know, looking at what's changed over the period I've been playing with this, and partly around this is around getting the ideas into use. And I thought I'd pull out some kind of do's and don'ts, really. So obviously, guy on the left is Norbert Wiener, and my favorite Norbert Wiener story is the one where he's moved universities and moved town, and goes out for a walk, and he's wandering around the streets and gets a little bit lost, and eventually he wanders around, and then eventually finds somewhere that looks a little bit familiar, but he still doesn't know how to get home. And he walks up to a little girl in the street and he says, "Little girl, do you happen to know where the Wieners live?" And she looked up at him and she said, "Yes, Daddy, we live over there." And, you know, we're in a discipline that was founded by people who had brains the size of minor planets, but really weren't safe to be out on their own. So there is a kind of another worldliness to the backstory of systems and cybernetics that I think is encapsulated in the great Norbert, you know. For me, in terms of actually getting the ideas into use with organizations, there's a number of don'ts. So don't lead with theory. If you think about this in Kolb learning cycle terms, the vast majority of people, somewhere between, depending on who you listen to, between 72% and 95% of people, their learning cycle does not start with theory. So if you start trying to convert people to think systemically or to think with cybernetics or to use these approaches, and you start with theory, you are basically shooting yourself in the foot 95% of the time. Yeah, it ain't going to work. I go back to there's a favorite quote from Bucky Fuller that if you want to change the way people think, don't give them a tool, the use of which will enable them to think in a different way. And that's kind of the way to go at it. Don't expect people to take the approach or you on trust. There's no reason why they should. Don't attempt to do a religious conversion. It doesn't work with most people. And don't just do something that is interesting to you. You know, that's not what this is about. What it's about is them and their problem, not us and our problem. So their problems are practical. If you can use systems and cybernetic approaches to solve their problems, then we're in a whole different story. Then we've got a different conversation going. Yeah. But that's kind of where you got to start. You got to start from where they are, not where we are. I think for me that the whole frame of practice has changed over this period. I remember talking to Alfredo Moscardini long time ago, back, I don't know, 2000 or something. And he was saying, you know, cybernetics, there's probably around 100 people in the UK who know anything about it, who are of any interest in it whatsoever. You know, this was a tiny, tiny number. When I learned it, roughly 10% of people who went through courses got it. So the basic failure rate of being able to pick it up from the available sources was really, really quite steep. Lots of stuff was done covertly. So my ex-business partner, her husband used to run a $2 billion operation for Continental brakes and tires. But he built his entire career using VSM to turn around businesses and told nobody how he did it. And he couldn't afford to tell anybody back then because they wouldn't have understood. I remember doing restructuring a 20,000 person organization without the senior management team even realizing what we were doing. And we kept everything covert because nobody would have got understood what we were doing. So 20,000 people, 4 people in the organization knew what we were doing. Yeah, lots and lots of covert operations. And I mean, I don't think we would dream of doing that now. So it's seriously demystified, I think. I think it's not just acceptable, it is accepted. And I think the evidence of thousands and thousands of people going through systems courses is evidence of that. My experience for the last 15 years, you know, when I first started, I could not talk about systems. I couldn't walk into a boardroom and talk about systems. They looked at you like you got the wrong number of heads. That hasn't happened for nearly 2 decades, for 15 years now. And my experience is that clients are really comfortable with the concepts if you explain them to them in the right way. And comments like, you know, why has nobody told us about this before? And it's taking people through designing their organization using BSM, the best approach I've ever seen. You know, this is from hardened senior managers, you know. I think I wanted to do a couple of ranging things really. And one of them is this: where on an innovation life cycle are we? And I haven't got an answer to this. I just want to sort of put it out there for you to have a think about. So if you think about an classic innovation life cycle, this is from Jeff Moore, starts with innovators. So people who are just interested in the ideas, moves through to visionaries, people who want to change the world using this new idea, to the mainstream, to, you know, the late majority, and then the laggards. And you can see the sort of rough populations of the distribution of the population in those different groups. And the way you have the conversation and the conversations that work with those different constituencies is completely different. So with innovators, they're interested in ideas that are cool. And if it does really whizzy stuff, that's fantastic. The thing they are absolutely not remotely interested in is what it's for. So ideas, approaches don't have to be useful. They just have to be interesting. Yeah. And you know you're in an innovator world if you're having those sorts of conversations. For the visionaries, their need is to be the first to do something that nobody else can. So they need revolutionary. They need it to be unique. So this is a snowflake because every time you do it, it's unique. It's handcrafted. They're all sort of the same, but actually everyone is unique. The thing that visionaries don't want is evidence of success because they want to be the first to have done it. If you talk about the evidence of success, you kill it for visionaries. Conversely, on the other side of the chasm, you get the early majority who will only take it if it's been proved. And they will only adopt it en masse if it's the standard approach and you can give them all the case evidence that it's been used. And the last thing they want to hear is it's a great new approach. And of course, you can see that as you go through this, the conversations are completely different. What the messages that will win for you with one group of people will absolutely kill it with another group of people. You can pitch where you are, both yourself in this innovation life cycle and whoever you're talking to, by the sorts of conversations they're interested in having. So in terms of, John, yes?
5 minutes.
Yep, good-o. And I think it's interesting to sort of reflect on where we sit within that as a set of approaches and where we aim to be. Because if you reinforce the behaviors that keep you to the left, you never get towards mass adoption. I think, you know, looking at clients, we get 4 types. So we get the zealots, the guys who've drunk the Kool-Aid. We get people who just want a solution and they don't want to know how you got there. They just want an answer to their problem. We have some that want a solution and want to know that you've got an approach, but they don't want to know what it is. And then we have some that want a solution and a skills transfer. The ones we really like are 4. The ones that scare me are 1, because they tend to drop you into hopeless projects just to satisfy themselves, really. But in a sense, you have to recognize and tailor the approach to suit where they are. And again, this goes back to the innovation life cycle, you know, calibrating where you are, where they are, and adapting to suit that. The religious conversion, which is what people used to talk about a hell of a lot in systems conversations, really only works with, if you want zealots. It's kind of not a great place to be, I don't think. This is another where are you in all this, I think. So this is some work we did in the SCIO board looking at the landscape, and we've got a polarity between where people want to be more, so inclusive, herds, they're enthusiastic, influenced by the few, but tend to be flighty in short term, versus the few, exclusive, individuals, grumpy, seeking to lead, persistent, because we're really locked into the approaches here, and long term. And at the top, the discourse is really about our tools are right. At the bottom, it's your tools are wrong. And on the other axis, power to, so how do you change the world? And on the other extreme, power over, the quest for IP and money. And you get kind of 4 different types of ways of being here. So the naive enthusiasts, the people who pick it up naively and want to change the world. There's an increasing number of systems popularizers who oversimplify things and are after a following. The gurus who want intellectual property and power, and we've got a few of those around. And the curmudgeons who just, you know, can't understand why nobody listens to them. Our argument is that where you need to be is somewhere in the middle, and balancing those off and feeling the tensions between them. So at different times, I feel pulled in different directions on this, and I think that holding that tension is kind of key to being a good practitioner and a good systemist, really. To deal with the naive enthusiasts, really, it's getting them to face the tough challenge. So it is actually harder than you think, you know, just picking something up very superficially kind of doesn't cut it. For the popularizers, making them aware of the really good old stuff that's been around and tried and tested. For the gurus, confronting them with what it's like in reality, in the swampy lowlands of actual practice, where their beautiful theories tend to get bogged down in the mud. And for the curmudgeons, a similar thing, really, actually exposing them to what it's like in context and pulling their ideas into the reality of the world, rather than, well, and out of the armchair where they love to sit and criticize others. And I think, you know, it's always a sobering thing to kind of position yourself around that. And of course, you can much more easily see where others are operating from in there. So that's kind of it, really. That's my contact details. If you want to go and have a look at SCIO, which is the professional body for practitioners, the website's there. For those who may not know, there is now a level 7, which is a master's level apprenticeship in systems practice, just launched in the UK. So if you are in employment with a large organization, you can get a master's level course for free in systems practice. And that's me done. John.
Superb. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, no, that's excellent. You ought to get rid of your slides at this point so we can see all the happy smiling faces. If you unshare, beautiful, you've done. Yeah, really interesting. It's it's prompted me to write down 3 pages worth of questions, and I'm not going to ask all of them at this point. But I think one that might help us, a lot of people, not everybody is a practitioner. A number of people are academics, or some of them are semi-retired or whatever. So I think that the exposition that says, look, we can use this in practice, and I've been doing it in this way, is superb. Because of a conversation I had with Chris Heald, who's also on the call somewhere this morning, how do you distinguish between the power of the tool and the power of the practitioner in your, to what extent are you being Patrick Hoverstadt, and to what extent are you being cybernetician in those engagements with clients?
There's obviously a degree of craft to doing it. So if you're taking a management team through redesigning their organization, there is a set of technical skills around how you take them through the process of using, in our case, VSM for the first time, when they've never come across it before. And there's a VSM or a systems degree of skill there that you need, like what do we pay attention to, what do we not pay attention to, what's the process we use, all that sort of stuff. And there's a basic level of just practitioner skill, but most of it is the former, not the latter, I would say. I think if you think about the practitioner skill, which is not system specific, as a hygiene factor, John, it won't get you there, but you're gonna really struggle without it. How's that?
Yeah, it's a great answer. I struggled with it as well. I could never quite work out how much of it is the toolkit and how much of it's me.
I think the practitioner, just practitioner skills keeps you in the room but doesn't get the job done. How's that?
No, that's fair enough. Now, listen, on my screen as I stare at it, sitting to your right is Malcolm. I think it's Coward, we pronounce it. Is that right, Malcolm?
It's Kaywood.
Kaywood, sorry. Malcolm's got a great question he's put in the chat, which says, and I shall quote because it'll give me so much pleasure to do so. You opened by saying that it was sloppy to use the terms systems and cybernetics interchangeably. What are the key differences?
I'm tempted to flirt that one over to Mike Jackson, actually. Who's on the call. I mean, obviously, the cybernetics specifically looks at feedback loops, and a whole load of stuff around that. And I would say systems is broader. Mike, over to you, mate.
I'm going to tell you, rather than answer the question, I'm going to tell you a story, which is, I think Bernard Scott was I saw originally was on this call. We've just been on a 2-hour session with the Club of Remy or something, and it was supposed to start a conversation between systems thinkers and cyberneticians. And it started off with a cybernetician putting systems thinking and in the box of general systems theory, where everybody tries to do nothing but understand systems and predict and control them, and saying that cybernetics was all about conversation and learning. And then we heard from a systems thinker who had cybernetics in the box of prediction and control, and said that systems, well, I mean, the conversation couldn't get going. People came with such predefined notions that whatever you said, they just wouldn't listen. The systems guy had a notion of what cybernetics was. The cybernetics guy had a notion of what systems was. I like the notion of cyber systemics. I don't think we need to concentrate on the differences between them. I think there are different strengths. I think the greatest practical tool that emerged out of cybernetics is the VSM, and I don't think systems thinking, if you want to make a distinction, has anything like that. On the other hand, the best intervention methodology that's emerged in cyber systemics is is probably soft systems methodology. And although the cyberneticians talk about second order cybernetics and conversational and all the rest, they have no methodology that can come anywhere close to soft systems thinking in that respect. So there are strengths in both traditions, although they engage with much the same type of issue and problem. And if you want a founding father who embraces both, go back to Bogdanov, the Russian systems thinker who both anticipated systems theory and cybernetics at the beginning of the 20th century.
He did get shot for it though, didn't he?
No, he killed himself.
Oh, he shot.
Well, no, he didn't kill himself. That's a matter of dispute, Patrick. That's another hour. It was a mistake when he was doing a blood transfusion.
Wow. Okay. So we've got some violence breaking out left, right, and centre as well. So I'm going to stop that one there at that point, if that's okay, and move on to our second speaker, David Dewhurst. Are you ready, David? Your microphone's on silent, so change that. Bit more complicated. I think David's slides are going to be moved on by Angus. And again, the idea is we'll have a listen to David, and then we'll do some simple questions like we've just done, and then we'll try and synthesize some meaning out of the whole. And David, you're coming at life from a very, very different starting point. I'm not going to try and explain what you're about. All I will say is David was the secretary of the society for 20 years, give or take a bit, and is current vice president. So he gets to do all the hard work, unlike me. So at this point, over to David and Angus to drive the slides, please.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you. Yeah. So if we could put the first slide up, Angus, it looks better than my face, please. I'm looking to see the first slide up. Oh, it's beginning. Okay, so what can we learn from trees? Well, we know from that glorious tautology, the theory of evolution, that which tends to fill space, from which we derive survival of the fittest, or sometimes survival of the randomly luckiest, not necessarily exclusive. Without it, we just have the inverse square law, that anything radiating from a source gets progressively more dilute and less influential the further away you get from the source. Admittedly, on that basis, the sun provides Earth with a useful 90 petawatts approximately, which we don't capture particularly adroitly. And often, radiation is channeled between an upper and lower limit, say Earth and sky, if you're a seed or a virus. Even the universe looks kind of flat from where we are. Admittedly, we may just be trapped in the outer film of a bubble, which could solve some paradoxes, but if the universe is a bubble, it definitely won't last. But paradoxically, the universe seems rather blobby. The second law of thermodynamics, that everything becomes more like dishwater, is countered by gravity, which creates big blobs of thermonuclear generators, also known as stars. Attraction as a growth strategy isn't only confined to, where are we? Planets and stars. The Chinese empire grew largely by people at the edge, capturing the center. Cities may be another example. You can think of your own. So if you think of the child's earliest drawing of a tree, which works well enough from a distance, it is simply as a blob, a bit cloud-like on a stick. Could we have slide 2, please? Right, here we're getting really technical. What else is like that? You all know the creativity exercise, think of as many uses of a brick as possible. My favorite answer is count it. More useful, in my opinion, for your children or parents is think of all the blob and line things that you can. A light bulb from a ceiling, a stem, flower, an old ball cock and lever, etc. So start thinking. In a moment, I'll show a list I prepared earlier but you may prefer to look away first. But anyway, Angus, could you please put up slide 3? So you'll see this form is ubiquitous, and it's fun pondering why. Generally, the stick leads to a supply, drainage, or control source, which enables easier access. Geometry only allows 6 circles around one circle of the same size, or in the case of spheres, 12. Don't tell me yet that clusters of cells can do all right. We might touch on that in about 15 minutes. So, harking back to evolution, one of the counterintuitive challenges is how can such improbable shapes as life shows us arise? A great insight in the 1900s came from Darcy Thompson in his beautiful book On Growth and Form, which points out that the limitations of 3D geometry constrain and channel evolutionary development. Slide 4, please. Looking at this ammonite, you might surmise that its growth strategies are constrained, but, and here's my visual example, suppose you poke the middle out and sort of slide it back a bit, you can get something definitely related, but clearly rather different. Okay, we'll have to wait for more 3D stuff to come along. Typically, life as we know it, Jim, has got to develop through fluids, air, water, mud. So it makes sense that strategies for doing this go with the flow. So let's remind ourselves of what this can look like. And now I'm afraid we're going to have to whisk through slides 5, 6, and 7. Slides 5 and 6 aren't opening up. So you're going to definitely have to do this at home. What you do is get a glass of water or a vase, fill it with water, let it settle, put a drop of ink or food dye in the top, and let's have slide 7, please, Angus. That, and watch what happens. You'll get, among a variety of things, some remarkably plank-like elements, and you can sort of see the branching and even the blobbiness on the end there. The engineer and mathematician, Sir Horace Lamb, said, "When I die and go to heaven, there are 2 matters on which I hope for enlightenment. One is quantum electrodynamics, and the other is the turbulent motion of fluids. About the former, I'm really rather optimistic. I think Werner Heisenberg said something similar. So when we're talking about navigating through a fluid in all its metaphorical glory, be prepared for surprises." Anyway, you've seen that blobs and branches may occur fairly easily. I really do recommend you to do this at home and watch a variety of what happens. Now, let's go to our third home tutoring exercise. You get as many sets of dominoes as you can, or something similar, like Lego blocks, and you throw out the challenge. Find out what pattern you can arrange them in to make them all fall as fast as possible. Now, with children, there'll be a lot of initial casting around, issues like timing accurately. I can send you a short sheet on this if you email me. However, pretty soon, they'll figure out that a branching Y pattern is faster than an I pattern, and Y's on Y's, on top of Y's, a better V's on V's, is faster still. Slide 8, please. Instead of 40 dominoes from start to finish, it's just 13. This, you all know, is the most basic fractal pattern, the pattern repeating itself on itself again and again from the previous level. But as you look at this actuality, you'll see some problems. You can't go on with this problem, with this pattern forever. The branches get in each other's way. Yet you can argue we're wasting time by having to make the stalks or branches go up to 4 dominoes long. If you actually arrange 40 dominoes, to get the shortest, quickest pathways from start to finish, you get something like slide 9, if you would, Angus. Okay, which suggests that the world should be covered with bushes. Of course, bushes did predate trees, and you can begin to think about why there's so much parallel evolution with trees rather than a single original ancestor. Let's just highlight this again in a sketch. If we look at slide 10, okay, and you can watch the development from each into something more tree-like. And I did find when I actually stretched the final sketch to the height, it really does look far more tree-like than the geometrically fatal one which I've kept there. Okay, and now it's definitely time to name check Benoit Mandelbrot. Can we have slide 11, please? And Mandelbrot taught us most of what we know about fractals. I really do recommend you to download the Fractal Geometry of Nature if you've missed out so far. It is free. I haven't pushed my brain through much of the mathematics, but you can learn plenty from just looking at the pictures. I thought this book was better than any of the summaries I've looked at since. And it's interesting that he massively references Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of cybernetics, more than anybody else. And of course, Wiener cites him in one of our foundational works, named, not surprisingly, Cybernetics. Obviously, you can modify the fractal template you build on. Let's see slide 12, please. This is what I tend to use in greeting cards because I can't draw. You can see how the same pattern has repeated itself on again and again. Okay, what other patterns get? Well, one exercise this may make you go to do on a walk, maybe with children, is to count how many branches you are typically getting on a stem, branch, or trunk, and how many forks or splits there are between the trunk and a particular terminal twig or leaf. And if you're a mathematical masochist, you can incorporate this information to estimate the number of leaves. It's about the same as the number of endings of a nerve cell or the dendritic bulbs at the end of the dendrite or synapse. Again, you can play around with elaborations of something like the fractal design I've just showed you. I've only talked about binary forks so far for simplicity. Often, around the end of the main trunk, you'll get about 5 boughs, which may each terminate in, say, 5 branches, and so on. You could search for the maximum number of shoots per node, somewhere between 2 to 7. You tell me if I'm wrong. You might call all this stuff 0th order cybernetics, because while it's definitely communication and control, for the moment, there's nothing you need to put in a program with a feedback loop in it to show a design of this coming up on the screen. When they actually do grow in reality, you can see a kind of dance and accommodation between trees near one another. So let's, for a moment, ponder the ubiquity of candidate tree patterns. May we have slide 13? Is this true? Please feed in ones I've forgotten or not thought of in due course. So going back to thinking about the dominoes, we've shown that the hierarchical branching system seems to be the shortest, fastest, most efficient route to get a message or resources like SAP out as fast as possible, and also to channel back the resources created in the leaves, and ditto the roots. One of my bugbears is when people talk about root causes. Root tips are no more causes than the leaves, both the structures to maximize interaction with available resources, light, water, organic elements, mycorrhizae, and usually to minimize them for others. Hopefully, by now, some of you are bristling with objections. This structure looks good for getting things out from the center. And if you tip a domino at the other end, the leaf end, the signal should just as quickly get back to the trunk. But you'll notice most of the dominoes remain standing. They haven't got the message. It's got to go all the way down or up again. Now, if a caterpillar has started to eat one of your brother or sister leaves, do you really want the message to go along to the dense center and back before you know and start manufacturing something unpleasant? 10% of the dry weight of plants on average, by the way, is poison. If you can't run away, what are your options? It would be cruel to point out to raw food vegetarians that only by chemical processing can much of the plant chemical be any good for you. Internally, we call it digestion. Externally, it's boiling, manufacturing, fermenting, etc., because we've got such little guts compared to a gorilla. Okay, in other words, could not other patterns or connections be better for communication across the whole plant or institution? Should we arrange the dominoes in a circle? Where you could start anywhere. Do we want to multiplex, have parallel branch lines to ensure the message gets through, rather than failing when one domino doesn't fall? Or if a human decides to harvest one bit of the tree with their circular saw. We're nudging here towards notions of distributed processing or intelligence, rather than a nomenclatura elite controller or the pretty dead heartwood at the core of the trunk. So let's go back to basics about how elements or parts can interact with one another. May we have slide 14? Between 2 points, you can only have one link. Between 3, 3, between 4, 6, you can see the diagonals of the square, and it goes up in the pattern of triangular numbers. For 5 points, it's 10 links. For 10, it's 55. For the Dunbar number of 150, which is the number of people we're supposed to be able to know properly, I'm nowhere near that. It's 11,325. So in an isolated village for 1,000 nodes of people in it, it would be about 500,000 n times n minus 1 over 2, or about half square of the base number of units that you've got there. And do remember, I've simplified all this by putting all the nodes around the edge of a circle, dotted all over the place. It's lots more fun. So there are issues of time and processing power in trying to interact equally with everyone. If you go into the third dimension or further, the rule for nodes and links still applies. You may know that in its first 2 years, the human brain spends a lot of its time deleting the links between brain cells. Artificial intelligence with neural nets depends on some links being inhibited. It looks like some sort of clustering linked to clusters is part of the answer, which appears to be taking us towards hierarchy again. Note that our computing capacity per node, our Dunbar numbers and so on, will increase our ability to move away from simple hierarchy, as may installing each node with a similar program. Let's call it a value system. A lot of you will know about the current generation of neural nets, which operates by putting individual nodes or processes in layers. Slide 15, please. You can start by thinking of it as a filtering device. It's thinking fundamentally about cutting down on the potential infinity of possibilities. You'll notice in this illustration, the 52 links is a lot less than the potential 136. And that difference in those two sizes increases massively with bigger numbers, with more elements. So let's reground ourselves by going back to the trees again and delivering a bit more on the title. We tend to draw a boundary between what's possible to be grown and what can be engineered or constructed. Let's look at slide 16. So I'd argue that the principles can align. So how do you get from this little oak tree on the left, that's slide 17, please, through the oak tree you saw at the top at the first, to the major oak in Sherwood Forest, and courtesy of Pete Dean, I think, is that photograph. They were celebrating the Charter of the Forest's 600th anniversary in 2017. I was told that when you're growing a network of business outlets, you keep them close at first to save on the supply lines and travel. Obviously, with high-end products, you'll have to make bigger jumps to trawl richer markets, maybe just a few capitals. And local geography often shapes your rollout. You can all work out, or have observed, that as a tree grows, it acquires the strength and height to put out larger branches, which will occlude or shade the lower ones, so they drop off. You can see extreme examples with a palm or baobab tree. The baobabs are flat at the top. They're not so different from my first domino pattern. Let's look at slide 18. So as you grow, you destroy. Now, you can point out the lower branches could travel along the ground and simply extend further into the light, like a young Christmas tree. And you can see plenty of those in Kew Gardens, but you don't see them a mile or two away in Richmond Park. Kew doesn't have any deer, Richmond does. The relationship between herbivores and trees is pretty fraught. Hollies manage by being spiky low down. And of course, trees behave differently alone or together. There's no point extending your lower branches underneath an adjacent tree. Sometimes when the tree has denuded itself of its lower branches, it will start to fuzz again at the bottom. Can we see slide 19 now? Left-hand side. And sometimes you'll discern an analogous phenomenon with them layering out as you go upwards. I'm not sure it's so evident on the slide on the right, but you can look for it. Okay, slide 20, please. So, which of these two trees in Brentford would you say is using its resources more effectively? If efficiency means getting out the maximum of leaves for the lighter substructure, it looks like the willow could be winning. You'll observe with the hazel or hornbeam or whatever on the right that the branches tend to come out more steeply as you're near the top, or do they just bend down more as they're overtopped? They're relatively straight. Often they come out near a horizontal and then curve upwards, kind of opposite to the willow. It's easy to create just so stories for whatever you see. If there was one best strategy, perhaps we'd only have one sort of tree. Okay, slide 21, please. So, does the monkey puzzle on the left have a better strategy than its relative on the right? Discuss. Which one is getting more light, or is the one on the right just getting shaggier and older? Thinking more widely, if the most efficient way of covering space is the geodesic dome, why aren't they growing all over the planet? You might object that once separated, branches can't grow together again, but they can. Slide 22, please. It's called inosculation, osculare in Latin means to kiss. Obviously, there's more mechanical difficulties in getting it together above ground, at least without tendrils, but you can find loads of plausible images on the net. It's much easier with roots. I found this root structure among several in Richmond Park on Friday. There's at least 2 in and I think 3 in osculations there, although one I haven't taken the, on the left, I haven't taken the little weed off. So get children looking for them. Thus, what I've been telling you about trees isn't absolutely true. It's a bit more plausible if you consider leaf patterns. Slide 23, please. Obviously, or at least if you look under a microscope, the obvious veins can't repeat an infinity of tree structures. When you get down to a particular layer of cells, like chloroplasts, blocking the sun, that the sap has to flow around, it's going to look more hexagonalish. I get annoyed when children confuse what are networks or lattices or webs or cracking patterns with tree structures, but here they are. Okay, you can't see them, you've got to imagine them here between the larger veins. If you look at the veins on the back of your hand or leg, which I'm guessing it's easier to see them if you're white, you'll see they are osculating. If you can't see yours, you'll have to get someone else to examine. The veins are clearer when people are hot or drunk. So if we start by talking about ways of filling space, and it helps us to conceive of space, if we think in terms of lattices, say squared paper or dotted squared paper, hexagonal wire netting, equilateral triangles, then up to 3-dimensional lattices, where moving up to 3-dimensional lattices, where it's easiest to stick to cubes. Now, consider what it would look like if you were stuck in the corner of a cubic lattice where only the vertices, the blobs, were visible. Might you construe it as being like a tree? May we see slide 24? Probably only with great difficulty. But consider your family tree. What it is from your viewpoint is different when we consider, say, a small population going back several generations. Might we have any other questionable perspectives? Within the layer of one big bubble, the universe seems flat and you are in the center. Hopefully, the diagram on the right-hand side will remind you of the osculating roots, which people take ages to notice. Aren't all organizations semi-lattices? And the pure hierarchies or blame charts we draw up rather a fiction? All this is wonderfully laid out by the architect Christopher Alexander in his late 60s paper, A City is Not a Tree. Slide 25, please. For which I have to thank Alan Thompson, former government chief architect, for telling me about. The left-hand side is just, bottom is just another example of a semi-lattice. Alexander's main point is that we tend to see things in tree-shaped modules, and a lot of city designs have messed up because of this. They make useful interaction awkward, but they are very neat and tidy. He goes on from this to examine how we are able to understand and construe things. Melville Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System and others categorize subject knowledge from 0 to 999. He effectively lined it up hierarchically, which is how we often see things. The greatest librarian of the 20th century, S.R. Ranganathan, came along and said that knowledge was more like his mechanostat. For younger listeners, these are strips of metal with holes in them that you can strew together and create, I suppose, lattices like cranes, bridges, fairground equipment, windmills, wheelbarrows. Ranganathan pronounced that each topic had additional facets, which he broadly grouped into personality, matter, energy, space, and time, 42 in all, I think, which got coded after the decimal point in what became called the colon classification and was incorporated into the Dewhurst Decimal Library of Congress and other major systems. So librarians see the structure of knowledge as between 2 and 42 dimensional, unlike most other library users. Alexander develops his argument about reality in the city or elsewhere with a city with only 3 interacting items: a drugstore, a news rack, and a traffic light. He points out that these may be seen or combined together in 8 ways. 3 groups of 2, remember that triangle near the top? Each of the 3 individual items all together, or ignore the whole lot. Obviously, the number of ways of construing, linking a basic set of discernible items increases with their number. A lot of slides back, we were considering how many ways you could combine just 2 items in a larger set of individuals. You may remember from statistics the formula for how many ways you can combine a particular number of objects from the number in a larger set. Maybe not just groups of 2, but 3, 4, 5, 20 items, etc. It's the number of items n factorial divided by the number that you're selecting, r factorial times n minus r factorial. But you don't need to remember.
David, about 5 minutes.
Cool. When you sum up all the possible groupings you can combine, it's much simpler. It's just 2 to the power of the number of items. Thus, with the 3-feature city, 2 to the power 3, 2 cubed gives you 8. Now consider the 10-node decagon I showed you much earlier. If you only consider the shapes with their vertices, the corners on the 10 nodes, how many shapes should you be able to see? And for this exercise, we'll include the 10 blobs and the 55 single lines and the empty set. Because obviously there's triangles, pentagons, what have you in there. Well, following what I said, it's 2 to the power 10, or 1,024 shapes in there, which certainly I can't see them all at once. Now, this consideration not only helps you think about the possible complexity of cities, it gives you a handle for thinking about constructivism, most postmodernism, maybe second-order cybernetics, without destroying your faith in reality. There are far more ways of seeing things, of traveling around, if you're the tip of a chute or a digital nomad, than we can handle. In different parts of this framework, different perspectives have their utility. Those that perceivers or responders, things in the group have similar perspectives or response patterns. Pretty complex behavior may emerge, as in bird flocks, insect swarms, finite automata. And that behavior modifies the realities. It was ever thus. Consider how the river valley channels movement with the channels movement with the hunter-gatherers and lot of other life and stuff. Today we use the channels of our roads as useful carriers for utilities. People complain during the setup, but they complain more if the internet, fuel or sewage connection goes down. And consider the freaky banyan tree. Slide 26, please. Which Peter Aubrey drew my attention to this morning. Here, you see one using the previous channel of the original tree to get up in the world. It's using what I suspect is a semi-lattice to squeeze, smother, and strangle it. After the original tree dies, the form remains. So you get these hollow forests. Could this be a metaphor for how we tend to build our intellectual structures and create the world thereafter? People argue that another of the strategies of the banyan tree is unusual. Where it can't find a way to grow up, it sends out long shoots or roots, leapfrogging or burrowing under surrounding vegetation, then dropping down roots and pushing up shoots at a more distant location. I've noticed strawberry plants and brambles doing the same. It's a bit like British imperialist history. And I think how we're planning to manage Brexit. If you have read, you may have read that an alder grove is all one plant underground. It's enough to start a conspiracy theory. But if you flatten out a tree from the top of the trunk, at least at its first branch, don't you basically get the same pattern? Ponder it. It partially works, but there's a bit too many overlays, which is what extra dimensions allows you. Envisaging a matrix to model human money or wealth flows would be a task for Hans Rosling. It's easier with human movement because it's basically two-dimensional. If you look at international flight paths, it's clusters and superclusters. And I suppose there'd be another layer underneath of iteration if you imposed mobile phone travel. It's very easy to look at these strategies and see them as zero-sum resource grabs and miss the co-evolution and co-creation. Apparently many baby boomers and established forest trees share a dilemma. The younger sapling may have to linger in the shade for hundreds of years until mummy or daddy topples over and they can make more of the light there. Professor Sir John Hills, head of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics and editor of Wealth in the UK, when his students ask him how to make money, replies, "Be very nice to your grandparents." And this was in the year before Thomas Piketty Capital in the 21st Century came out. However, while trees can only move around in 3 dimensions, and pretty slowly at that mentally and metaphorically, we can do more. When Brian Warburton, my predecessor as secretary, asked his college principal why he wasn't being promoted, he was told, well, there isn't a lot of space at the top of a triangle. Now, every head teacher knows the answer is to create a lot more triangles, more gold stars, colors, teams, houses, house points, not just one linear competitive system. This analysis was improved on by the Economics Nobel Prize winner, Elinor Ostrom, who emphasized that polycentric governance systems can and do transcend 101 game theory, although it's not a simplistic panacea. A commons can behave selfishly as well as a PLC, but meeting and agreeing at multiple nodes is a long tradition. May we have the last slide, please?
1 minute, David, please.
This is Julie Timbrell's drawing of the Ankerwick U at Runnymede. We know it's been a people's meeting place for hundreds of years. It's 1,500 years old, roughly, we think. It's one of the contenders for the location of the signing of the Magna Carta, which made governance slightly more polyvalent. Around its periphery are a circle of yew trees, only a few hundred years old. I don't know how she got them there, but they look very nice. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, David. Do you want to take the slides down, Angus, please? So I have an immediate question that comes out from that, and it was popped up by Angus on the chat as we went through. And Angus said, we cannot understand tree structures without context. So, David, any comments on that?
Well, it's always more fun to disagree. It certainly helps. I mean, you can draw a tree structure alone, but to know whether it's appropriate. We get funneled by the landscape in all senses, and it does depend on what you are actually looking at. So maybe Angus would be better giving me his examples than me guessing out and delineating them. I mean, clearly, if you look at our brains, it's like layers of trees on top of layers of trees in some parts, but they do different things in different parts. Not a very good answer, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Dave. If I go to Angus quickly, and then Mike Jackson's got an observation as well, please. Angus.
Well, if we look at autobiosis, the contention of Maturana and Varela was that all individual species evolve in the context of their environment. So the species evolves and adapts with its environment, its ecological environment, and the ecological environment or ecosystem adapts with it. And you can see that a particular tree shape, for example, will morph. The same species will morph between the far north where it's cold and further south, or the bottom of a mountain and the top of a mountain. And you will also find structures that are based on where it's dry, where it's clay soil, where it's wet, where it's hot, all of those kinds of things. And also what other kinds of things are growing around it lead to adaptation, because the trees actually weave between each other and they optimize the amount of light, not only individual trees, but trees between trees. And so they optimize light. So the whole forest is optimizing light between them, and they're communicating between each other. So as a result, the structures of trees are adapted to the soil, the conditions, the climate, and what else grows in that kind of environment, and what other predators are there. You see adaptation in which what happened in Yellowstone National Park, where when they reintroduced wolves, that adjusted the behavior of elks, the change of behavior in elks adjusted the behavior, what happened with trees, that changed, and so on.
Well, thank you for saying so many things I didn't have time for there. And yeah, I mean, we should acknowledge this sort of insight from Goethe and maybe parts of anthroposophy as well. Okay, you can argue there's a game plan, a DNA, which has of course been created environmentally itself, but sometimes you want to bracket that, and then it responds to what's around it as it comes along, rather like my goal plans in life.
On the subject of Maturana, we have him speaking at the Cybernetics Society in a couple of months' time.
Thanks, Angus. Can I go to Mike Jackson now, please? Mike.
Yeah, I think Angus has just made the point, but he credited the insight to Maturana and Varela. I'm afraid it goes back further. And interesting, it's great that you mentioned, David, the book by Wentworth Thompson, which was On Growth and Form or something,
yeah,
1917. Now there's the anticipation of the idea. Because for him, there are only certain structural forms that can emerge. But of course, they are constrained by the particular environment in which, well, the physical laws, or I guess mathematical laws, constrain the type of structural forms that can emerge. But the environment also has an impact upon those which actually do emerge, in other words, through evolution. So this does give quite, as Maturana would say in regard to the organism, does give quite a lot of autonomy back to the thing itself, according to the physical laws embedded in it, which constrain what exactly can survive given the particular environment. There's something physical or mathematical underpinning the type of forms that can emerge. I think that's what Thompson was saying, and I think that's what you're saying to some extent.
Yeah. It's totally right, and that goes back to, as David was saying, goes back to Goethe, and indeed it goes right back to Aristotle. He describes, so it's a very ancient.
Yes, yeah.
David, did you want to come back in?
Well, I thank you for amplifying what I didn't have time for. And yeah, do look at On Growth and Form. Again, just look at the pictures. It's better than most lectures.
So, does anybody else want to come in? We'd quite like us to start trying to see if there's a synthesis of the two very different sets of ideas we've been. I've got one link right in the middle. So I've got a starting point, unless anybody else has got one. Mike, go on, Mike, after you.
I'll have a go. And it's this. I don't know whether David, another person who went with Thomson inspired was Geoffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute. Do you know that?
I've heard of the Santa Fe Institute. I don't know Geoffrey West.
Yeah, he's written a book that you must read. Oh God, I've forgotten its name.
Okay, Geoffrey West.
Geoffrey West, and it's this idea of power laws.
Yeah.
You know that, for example, you get similar sort of power laws coming up in all sorts of environments. The extent, if an animal doubles in size, then certain things happen. If a city doubles in size, it only needs 85% of the infrastructure extra that the smaller city would need.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. These are sort of power laws, mathematical structural laws in nature, which seem to govern systems, individual, organismic, or social. Now, my attempt to link this is this. Patrick could go in with his viable system model and say, hang on, I've got some structural laws here, which actually fit any kind of system, as Corsair claimed, whether it was an amoeba, a bee colony, a small organization, a multi-organization. He could go in there with that sort of model and be very proud of himself. And that's incredibly useful, the kind of thing you've been talking about. But I wonder how far he would get, which is the point he made. Now, West has in his book a quote that I used, which to me sums it all up, really. West says, we may look different, dress differently, speak different languages, and have different belief systems, but to a large extent, our biological and social organization and dynamics are remarkably similar. For Christ's sake, you know, they're similar, and yet we look different, dress different, speak different languages, and have different belief systems. Now, I think you're getting at is what is very similar. Patrick knows that he has to alter what he does with the viable system model in his consultancy practice, because we all look different, dress differently, speak different languages, and have different belief systems. Is that any help?
Patrick, let's have Patrick have a go at that one first, David, then we'll come to you and then throw it open.
I think that's right. And I think there's a, you know, to go back to Malcolm's thing about what's the difference between systems and cybernetics. One of the things, I mean, you know, this comes into both, but it's kind of more accentuated, I think, in systems and in cybernetics is the role of boundaries. And of course, what's, you know, the point about boundaries is that what's inside the boundary is different to what's outside the boundary. When you cross the boundary in a you know, a law of crossing kind of way, you are, the way people think, the way people feel, the way people talk, the logic structures, the emotional structures within the boundary all shift. That's the nature of the boundary, and it happens inevitably when a boundary is constructed around the system. And you know, the boundary is constructed around the system by the cybernetics of the system. It is that looping round of the logic structure of the system that creates the boundary. So, you know, that's a self-referential idea that comes out of cybernetics, but in some ways systems deals with it better. But, you know, when you move into that different organizational structure, the fundamentals are the same, but the behaviors are all different, or many of the behaviors are different. You know, and what we're dealing with in systems and cybernetics is the underlying structures that generate the behaviors. That's what we're interested in how this underlying structure generates that emergent property that is the property of that system. So, you know, there's a kind of partly what I was talking about is the price of entry to be able to play with that. That you have to take on some of the, you have to not be too alien to the system to be able to interact with it at all, and you have to build that action back into your cybernetics. So I would somewhat disagree with you, Mike, that there isn't good cybernetic methodology to compare with SSM. I think there are. I don't think it's as sort of extensively discussed, but the cybernetics of action, which I would characterize as second order cybernetics, what us doing the cybernetics of how we interact with the system is, I think profoundly important. And I think it goes to the heart of that. At what level are we playing? Are we adjusting our behaviors, the outer skin, the what is observable, so that we can interact with the underlying structure, which is the meat and drink of both systems and cybernetics? And I think David's been talking about that quite rightly, that the fundamentals of that underlying structure. And I was talking more about the price of entry to be allowed to play.
David.
Yeah, all true to a degree. You can see an organization or whatever at a number of systemic levels. And for me, there's not enough oscillating between the local granularity and the whole system. When I became president of my students' union, I tried to use my sociology subsidiary to figure out how I should influence things in the university. And it was a lot less useful than using my psychology about how I simply squared the bursa. And, but it's, I think there are a number of things you have to do on a number of levels. One is usually looking plausible enough. And yeah, people have different self-beliefs, and until you can demonstrate your appreciation of their self-belief, they're probably not going to sort of buy into whatever sort of structure you're trying to lay on them.
Okay, anybody else want to come in? Don't see any hands waving at the minute. Angus.
Well, this is a complex topic, and we're going to talk very briefly about it, but I somewhat disagree with Patrick to begin with. I think that if we take something like me or a tree, I have a problem of dealing with the physics of gravity and therefore maintaining my balance, and so does a tree or any plant. Now, that would be an underlying structural issue which systems and physics and so on could analyze and look at very effectively, and you could look at various design issues with dealing with it. From my point of view, the essential thing is that cybernetics would say that you have to build the internal structure. The living thing builds the internal structure within itself in such a way as to cancel the effects of gravity. If I trip, I fall over because physics takes over, gravity takes over, and I lose my balance. But in the ordinary course of things, I act in order to maintain my balance and to cancel. Trees also are designed to overcome gravitational effect. And you can see the story of, for example, also things like wind blowing at them, and you can see the story of what's been blowing at them from their shape. So I'm not saying that there aren't structural forces, but the key thing about cybernetics is that it is a process whereby the organism develops its own autonomy in order to cancel out the effects of the external world's structures, forces, and so on. And that might be something to explore in relationship to these two. But I do think both of them were primarily systems conversations rather than cybernetic ones. Just as, I mean, not criticizing them for that fact. It's just, if we look at it, it's more of a systems description than a cybernetic description.
maybe systems theory is zero order cybernetics, and we go meta on that, but that would definitely annoy some other people.
I mean, they need, you know, they both have uses.
Yeah, and the stability and instability of feedback systems as a way of controlling the whole caboodle is very much underappreciated even by cyberneticians. The electrical diagram for an old-fashioned electrical bell, which is a simple oscillator, is very similar to the electrical diagram for an old-fashioned thermostat with a bimetallic strip. Yeah, one is supposed to stabilize, one isn't. Therefore, you get overcompensation, which, you know, Beer's talking about, Macmillan talking about without a data, and so on. The whole issue of stabilization, does feedback actually allow us to simplify things, or does it actually add to the complexity? And there's a nice thick old book here by Stephen Wolfram, who sort of talks about this, a new kind of science. It's fairly old now.
Mike, you were nodding your head at something a moment or two back.
Well, I try to link it back, but I was going to respond to Patrick, but I'll link it back to what David said as well. I think this distinction between, you know, if you like, ultimate forms, and to what Angus said, ultimate forms, and if you like, what cyberneticians might call the surface phenomena, is absolutely fascinating. And when Patrick said he saw, you know, addressing things like people's beliefs and behaviours and the rest of it, if I just put it crudely, as the point of entry to doing proper cybernetics. Sorry if I'm simplifying it. Of course, if you took somebody like Checkland, he would have the totally opposite point of view. He wouldn't think that, he wouldn't consider worth even discussing these structural laws, because in his view, the organizations operate according to these beliefs and appreciations and meanings that people bring to their situation. And therefore his methodology is all about dealing with those sorts of issues. And he wouldn't give a tuppence for the viable system model, except perhaps as another conversational tool, a debating tool at stage 4 of his methodology. And I was at I gave a talk to the Metaforum thing the other night about what I call the soul of the viable system model. And there are various pulls on the viable system model. If you read Beer, he's of no doubt that it's a scientific model. And you quoted, Patrick, some people who have tried to test it empirically by saying that, you know, 71% confidence that it gives good and it gives good results. So, and Beer was all the time taught the laws of viability set themselves up. This is a scientific model as far as he was concerned. Nothing to do with the observer. Once you've decided and determined what your system is, if you want to design it to be viable and effective, then you have to obey certain systemic laws. But so that's one drag on it. On the other, you have another drag on it, where so people are saying, well, actually, and I think that they're going overboard on this notion that it's the price of entry. They say that actually all it is a hermeneutic enabler. In other words, it allows you to have certain conversations about issues such as coordination and control and strategy, as you like. But it's actually not much more than that. All it is a hermeneutic enabler. You can have you can use it to have conversations about. But that, of course, to me, and I think possibly to you, takes all the power away from the model. You know, it's not just another conversational tool. It does have some fundamental laws underpinning it, which I think I'd want to argue, you know, managers or administrators ignore at their peril. So that's you know, that's why this debate, I think, is really, really interesting.
Malcolm, to come in from the right, please, first, and then I'll come to you, Bernard, if that's okay. So Malcolm first. You put yourself on mute, my friend. Malcolm, you're on mute.
Oh, I thought I'd taken that off. No, just a couple of observations really, and I think it answered. I'm trying to sort of like just contribute to that question of, is there any commonness between these two presentations? Patrick, when he started, I liked that animated slide where it kind of went round in the whole feedback. And I think from other stuff I've read of Patrick's, that it reminds me of this idea of something I only read a couple of weeks ago, niche construction. Basically where an animal might create their own niches, which will create their own affordances, which will feed back into actually selecting for their own evolution. So the whole thing is a kind of a feedback loop. And then something that Angus just posted about half an hour ago, vis-a-vis the second presentation, you cannot understand the tree structure without the context. And again, it was just those two things, if you like, Angus's comment and Patrick's opening thing, that made me think, can we understand this in terms of niche construction? So it's more, what started as an observation has ended as a question.
Does anybody want to try and answer that one? David or Patrick? Patrick, go.
Well, it's sort of across that and across Mike's in a way. So I think the way you express the sort of Checklin view of this, Mike, is bang on. Working with VSM, one of the things that comes out incredibly strongly is the way in which an understanding the system, you know, if you're looking at organizations through using VSM, you start to understand why people in this system self-organize in the way they do and help the system to evolve in particular ways that enables them to think and feel in particular ways within that system. So there's a degree of people thinking the system, and there's a degree of the system thinking the people. So how does it create how does the system create the situation in which people do think this and feel in this way and don't think that and feel in that way? What they can see, what they can't see, what they're able to understand and what they're not able to understand. And of course, we can think about that as them as individuals, but that's in a way to miss the point that they are different when they walk out of this organizational system and into a different one. They are not the same. They don't think the same. They don't feel the same. They don't look at things in the same way. When you are within the university system, or when you were within the university system at Hull, you were not the same person as you are at home. You know, some of you is, but some of you is not. And some of you is being thought by the university. You know, what you can think there, the opportunities that you can see, how you can adapt is being done to you by the system, which you are also creating at the same time. So you are there creating the system that is also in effect creating you. And I mean, part of what you're going through with VSM and any cybernetic model is, what are the cycles of that becoming? That
Isn't
process
that
of becoming.
John, I'm lined up next.
Angus has been waiting.
Yep.
I'll also add something to what Patrick has just said. My first thought was in this discussion was that in one of Stafford's papers from 1969, I think it is, it refers to organizations as esoteric boxes. And it's rather like looking at a culture from the perspective of an anthropologist. You have to learn how to communicate with, you have to learn to speak the language of the organization. So immediately that softens up the consultancy, which you've been talking about. But also with respect to what John said about the hermeneutics of the VSM, the point about the VSM, it is a model. It's a non-verbal construct. It's not just people talking, using words to come up with some sort of thing. Oh, well, yes, you know, we're looking at the same, we agree, but there is something about which to be agreed. And if the conversation is positive, constructive, then shared eigen behaviors arise, and hopefully, you know, client and consultant
come to some shared understanding of what on earth this model is about.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to comment on was what Patrick said very early on, that often as a consultant, you don't mention the fact that you're using the VSM or that you're doing cybernetics and so on. And I'll say this is, I found this true. I've worked in education in various settings, and I've used cybernetics all the time, but very rarely has it ever been explicit that that's what I'm doing.
But Bernard, can I just chip in there? What I was saying was that used to be the case, hasn't been like that for 15 years
Yes,
in our practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I was interested to see you say that, because I've been retired for 10 years.
Yes.
So,
Can I just riff a bit?
sorry, David, I have one further thing I wanted to say that Patrick was alluding to before, was that we think differently, or we are different people in different contexts. The Pascal tool was different conversation to May's, but it's quite true. It's, you know, psychologically, if we, as I'm sitting here talking to you lot, gentlemen, lady, I've got cybernetics on my brain. If I go outside and sit in my car, I become the driver of a car. We have a whole repertoire of affordances and concepts and understandings, and we, as it were, we compile them as we need them and move about. So this isn't something new, but the important thing about being part of an organization is that the participants construe themselves as such. But you're quite right, each one will have his own perception of what the organization is and what it's about, but he will be seeing himself, I am part of this organization, just as right now I'm saying I'm part of the cybernetics group.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bernard. So if I can go to David first, then to Angus, I think, waiting.
Yeah. Just to re-emphasize that niche construction, which is related to autopoiesis, is everywhere. And I love the Thomas Sachs line, in the jungle, it's eat or be eaten. In the human world, it's define or be defined. And organizations are very often a struggle at mutual, at self definition, where sometimes some people try to become the priests of the defining system, but there's an awful lot of interaction of creating an ethos or whatever there. It's far simpler with trees creating their own niches and transpiring, changing the weather. And you probably know that more than 400 miles in from a continent, all the water that falls pretty much is from trees transpiring nearer the land. So yeah, they've got that stuff better than a lot of life forms.
Thanks, David. Angus.
Well, I think I might have detected another point of contact in the conversation, which is this. We heard just now about people being different in different environments. Patrick was talking about it at work, at home, and so on and so forth. And we've heard about adaptation to niche and so on. David was talking earlier on about trees. So it's this. The tree adapts its behavior during the course of the year. For example, in the winter, it drops leaves, and so in the changing climate and so on. It's actually, they've found that trees are able to recognize what kind of winter is going to come along. And in the late autumn, they adjust their behavior, moisture, how they hold it and things like that in preparation for the type of winter that is coming up. It's really remarkable how they do that. Also, they adjust to pests and things like that. So a tree with leaves, a tree without leaves, a tree that's pumping certain chemicals out, not pumping certain chemicals out, is adapting to its environment. A person at work is adapting to his or her environment. They go home, they behave differently, adapting their environment. A tree does it on one kind of time cycle. People do it on another type cycle. Ecologically or evolutionary wise, they adapt in context with their environment, and they adapt over much longer periods of time. So if you look at different time periods, what looks like massive identity differences is the adaptation of an organism or an organization, because organizations also adapt their behavior. At the moment, most organizations of the world are behaving very differently from what they were doing in 2019 as a result of the present situation. So, and they evolve over time as new technologies and things like that come along. or as they grow, or as market situations change. So this kind of adaptation process, which is often described as different identities, can also be looked at as merely the different responses we have to the situational aspects at all kinds of levels. And this is happening right down to the cells in the individual plant or person, or the individuals in an organization and their cells and so on.
Thank you, Angus.
Can I just say to Angus, you've just used a metaphor, an analogy. You've taken the biological world and then you've transposed that into this social human organization world.
No, I haven't. I'm not using a metaphor. I think that you can make a metaphor. What I'm doing is I'm making an analogous argument, a homological argument.
Well, a metaphor is a compressed analogy. But when you say the human organization, like the enterprise, adapts, that's analogical to the biological. You're giving agency to the organization. The enterprise.
Oh, I do, absolutely.
Well, it's the human beings who comprise the organization who have agency.
We could take a long time on this, and I spend a long time on this particular point, but I suspect that let's not hijack this meeting on that.
Yeah. It's 5 to dinner time, ladies and gentlemen. So I'd love to be able to sort of draw together a coherent argument and say, look, isn't that brilliant? Haven't we solved the problem of world famine or something? I think we're quite a long way from that. So two very, very different talks. And gentlemen, thank you both very much for the time and energy to pull them together. That leaves me with there's a very clear for me connection between if a tree as process and organization as process in those two things, and the sense that both emerge from their internal interactions, but also their interdependencies with the context in which they're created. And what we can learn from a tree, we might be able to teach to an organization. And what we learn from an organization, we might be able to teach to a tree if we were gardener enough. I'm not entirely sure. The thing that's in my head listening to it is the tree is effective at being a tree. The intervention of a consultant in an organization is commonly designed to improve the efficiency of the organization rather more than its effectiveness. And I wonder if there's something we could learn in organizational cybernetics and organizational applications of cybernetics about actually making the organization more effective rather than more efficient, and in doing so start to address some of the some might put a note in there somewhere about sort of post-capitalist economy or post-capitalist thinking, whether bringing some ideas of that into the way we think about organizations. I'm certainly not suggesting Patrick doesn't do this, but we could bring some different thinking to the way in which we pull organizations together and drive them forward. We can see you waving, Emma, and smiling and laughing. So it's 4 minutes to Angus. Would you care to give us a quick reminder of your next event, which I think is only 2 weeks away?
Yes, you're right. And it happens on the Tuesday as opposed to the Wednesday. And it happens at 6 and it lasts 90 minutes. And in the next one, what we're looking at is principles that are involved in the organization of government, relationship between the use of law and policy making in social organization, local government, and things like that. And it's a very interesting subject. How do you make use of those kinds of things?
Brilliant. Thank you, Angus. So that's in a couple of weeks' time. Thereafter, on the 10th of March, we have another one of these events. And joining us on that occasion will be Abdul Aziz, strange enough, talking about a viable operating model, so a method for applying the VSMs. That's covered quite conveniently as, look, there's a methodology, and I know that there are others. And he's going to be followed by Peter Cochrane, some of you will know, talking about the notion of Gaia and sentience with the underlying everything really is connected as his strap line. So that's coming up over the next month. Important to remind you, there's a lot of good comments in the chat, so please do look back at that and see what you can pull out of there. Quite a few suggestions for places to go and look for stuff. remind you that the previous events are now available on YouTube, and also say to you, those of you who've listened attentively, maybe you'd like to be a David or a Patrick or a Mike or an Angus on a future occasion. There are opportunities within the series for people to say, I think I've got something I'd like to share with the audience. So if that's you, please let me know and we'll make it happen. On the end of that, thank you all very much. Thank you to Angus.
John, sorry, give me 1 second. I'm very sorry, but I gave you the wrong information. I gave you the one that's 2 away. The next one is actually second order science. And so it's a kind of colloquy around with Stuart Umpleby, and he's going to be talking about his notion, well, not his notion, but he's very enthusiastic about the notion of second order science, logic, strategies, methods, a colloquy, and it's going on to a new way of thinking about how science itself must proceed. Many of you will know Stuart is one of the leading figures in both systems and cybernetics theories. It's going to be a very good one to do. Okay. That's the 25th of February.
25th of February. That's
Thursday, 25th of February.
Brilliant. Thanks, Angus. Thanks, everybody, very, very much. Enjoy your various dinners, suppers, breakfasts, or whatever time of the world it happens to be where you are. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks a lot. Good night.